keep letting more and more people in from the waiting room as they're,
They're all flooding in,
yeah,
rushing from lunch or meeting or whatever else, just getting right in.
yeah. It's a good thing about these lunchtime or lunch adjacent sessions, I think, right? So friends, if you have your cameras on and yet you're joining us for lunch, that's totally fine with us. Very good. All right. Well, I think I'll go ahead and start us off if that's okay with you. Do you want me to wait another minute, Keegan, or do you want me to go ahead and get us started?
Yeah, I think it's great for us to get
Okay.
started.
That sounds good.
Those who drop in will catch up.
Okay. And folks, as you're joining us too, if you'd like to share in the chat, just introduce yourself to say hello, share your pronouns with us and where you're joining us from. That would be great just to be able to say hello to folks and get familiar with who's all in the room with us. Vernon has shared that with you in the chat, so you can respond to Vernon's post there too. My name is Abby Prince. I'm at LeaderShape, and I'm glad to be able to kind of kick things off with our sixth series of virtual conversations that we're providing for leadership educators. Pardon me. We've had over 2,100 people registered to engage in the first 5 series that we've hosted so far. And we're glad to be back for another round with you all too. The purpose of our time together is to share questions, thoughts, and best practices as we continue to reimagine how we deliver engaging leadership programs to students through virtual platforms. I think most all folks are familiar with Zoom, but I'll go ahead and share this slide with you all here. If you are still kind of getting comfortable with Zoom, or maybe you haven't been in Zoom with people that you don't know and work with on a very regular basis. So post your comments and questions in that chat as you have them. We'll post a couple of poll questions kind of early on in our time together for you all to respond to. If you have a question for me that you don't want to share publicly, you can just send me a private message in the chat where you see right now it says to everyone. You can just drop down and choose to Abby Prince, and I will get that message to respond to you. And then we kind of encourage you to keep your cameras off and keep yourself muted. But if there is a time when it is easier for you or better for you to respond to a question or raise a comment by unmuting yourself, please feel that you can do that briefly so that we can respond to that as well. Just kind of some general house cleaning comments to share with you here. LeaderShape would like to also begin this presentation by acknowledging that the land each of us is on is the original homelands of Indigenous and tribal nations. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from these territories, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land. Please honor and acknowledge the Native and Indigenous peoples from the land that you are joining us from, and give thought to your ancestry and the generations that came before you. I'm joining you all from Piatt County in central Illinois, which were the lands of the Potawatomi and Kickapoo Indigenous peoples. And so I am glad to be joining you all as we talk more about a topic that is important to me, is important to Keegan. But first, I want to share with you LeaderShape's vision and mission statement. LeaderShape is a vision is a just, caring, and thriving world where all lead with integrity and a healthy disregard for the impossible, with a mission to transform the world by increasing the number of people who lead with integrity and a healthy disregard for the impossible. So welcome to our community if you're just joining us for the first time. Once again, I'm Abby Prince, the Director of Program Quality and Management at LeaderShape. I'm so glad to be joined by Keegan Mills today as we talk through this topic of what trauma, how we acknowledge that trauma. And so Keegan is a holistic wellness practitioner and consultant and a member of the LeaderShape community. And we're so glad that she's joined us to assist in facilitating this conversation. You likely read Keegan's full bio in the description of the meeting invite that you saw when you registered to attend this, but I would like to invite Keegan to just share a little bit about herself now.
Thank you, Abby. So appreciate that. And such a great welcome. So, greetings, everyone. My name is Keegan Mills. I'm a wellness practitioner and consultant. So, what that means is I work with individuals and organizations on how they can incorporate holistic wellness into their life. I do that through teaching yoga, meditation, mindfulness. I'm also a coach, so working with people one on one on how they can really get clear and out of their own way so they can focus on being purposeful in their life. So it's a little bit about who I am and what I do, and you'll get to know more about me as we go through our conversation today.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Keegan. I appreciate your introduction and I appreciate your work too.
Thank you.
Yeah. For this series, we've asked Keegan to provide a couple of polling questions just to help us give some context to who's all joining us as participants. So I'm going to display the first of our 3 polling questions for you here. So you see this on your screen to respond to. I've been asked or told by my supervisor to just push through during this past year. Yes, only all the time, sometimes, and never.
All right. See some of these coming in. Really like these polls. It's a way to like take a pulse of where people are where we all are and where we individually are.
I agree. So it looks like I think everyone except you, except you and I, Keegan, have responded to that. So I'll go ahead and share those poll results here. And sometimes, and that's, I guess, not surprising, but also kind of hurts my heart a little bit that sometimes we need the boost. We need someone to help us push through. And sometimes that could feel a little more gentle, I think, and what we need to hear in those moments.
Mhm.
Let me display the second poll question for you here, which is I felt drained and exhausted most days this past year.
Mm,
Yeah.
coming in.
Yeah. Coming in quickly, I think, with these
I
responses.
feel like that was like okay, I can answer that right
Yeah,
away.
I know exactly what my answer is to this question.
Mhm.
So with everyone except for us responding, I will share those results that, yeah, sometimes I felt pretty drained and exhausted. And I wonder if it's hard to gauge that maybe, but does it feel like more than in past years? Is it because of what all we're going through that it feels like, yeah, this feels a little more draining and a little more exhausting than what I'm used to, perhaps. And cheers to these 3 people who have shared with us that not at all, I feel great. Good for you. And then for those folks who have shared that only all the time you feel this way, hopefully we can get you some help and some resources and how to respond to that. And so for our third poll question here, then I will launch this for you now. There's been a culture of well-being at our universities and organizations where we've been asked to do less and take care of ourselves and our students who have staff more so than pre-pandemic. Keegan, I appreciate these all caps words and what that has probably felt like as it's come at you when someone's telling you to do less. Very good. I think I've shared with some of you here that in my past work and in corporate environments, we would have posters on the walls that would say, work-life balance is really important, but then no one shows you how to do it and no one's role modeling it and no one is um, tapping you on the shoulder and praising you for doing it well. And so I think that we see a lot of that here as I will share these poll results with everyone, just in thinking about like, yeah, I am definitely
Yeah.
participating or being subjected to that culture and being told to do less. So
It's a
thank
little,
you
it
for
looks
that.
like it's a little bit of half and half too.
Yeah, that's good.
Absolutely. And, you know, not sure what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, I will stop sharing those poll results here with you as we move on into the kind of the guts of our conversation and topic here today. And we know that so much has happened in our world and in our communities and in our campuses since March of last year. And we thought that this would be a good time to pause and reflect about the toll that that has taken on us during these multiple pandemics that have taken on us and on our students. And so thank you, Keegan, for agreeing to join us today. And I will turn things over to you.
Excellent. Thank you. So I think if we could just, yeah, I'll talk a little bit about my story. So I shared a little bit about who I was, who I am, not who I was, who I am, and share more specifically about the topic that I wanted to bring about acknowledging our collective trauma. So my interest in trauma really began when I was working at a university, Holy Names University. So my background is in higher education and community activism. If you read my bio, I spent about 15 years of my career in university and community work. And so I was working at Holy Names University. I was the director of our Center for Social Justice and Civic Engagement. And one of my staff members brought up, shared with me this TED Talk. And it was a TED Talk from Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. And it was around how our childhood experiences impact our adult, but also how there are childhood experiences that are traumatic and how they impact one's health. And it really stood out to me, especially because the community I was working with, my staff were all staff of color. My staff who brought it to me, actually, he was an asylum seeker. And most of the organizations that we worked with were working with immigration law, working with students and community members who were here in the United States seeking asylum from countries of violence and war. And so a lot of the work that we were doing was embedded in this idea of trauma. So when I watched this video, it blew me away, number one, because it was just, wow, holy cow. And for me personally, it interests me because of my own history. So I grew up in a family of domestic violence. I grew up in poverty. I grew up around alcoholism and addiction. And yet I somehow got out of that. And so I took what is called adverse childhood experiences assessment. And from that, if anybody's done Strengths Quest or Strengths Finder, if you're familiar with that, I'm a Strengths Finder junkie. And one of my strengths is input, which is like an information hoarder. So when I watch documentaries, like the best way I explain this strength is if you watch a documentary, before it ends, you already are on Wikipedia trying to learn more about whatever it is. That is me. I love learning about things. I love just gathering information. And so for me, when I saw this TED Talk, I was super intrigued because not only it affected me personally, it also impacted, it was talking about a lot of the students that I was working with and a lot of the community members I was working with who had experienced these adverse childhood experiences. And so that just, went down a rabbit hole of my own self-inquiry of how trauma shows up in individuals and in communities, and then how that continues to show up in our society. And so from there, I went on to do other work. I incorporated a lot of the tools that I had learned and a lot of the things that I had learned in trauma-informed work into my work with staff. So incorporating meditation and mindfulness, and looking at how, especially working in social justice, how can I incorporate much of this in that work? Because most of the communities that we were working with were communities that were affected by trauma. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. And from there, I actually decided to I went into a yoga teacher training, and it led me down this like rabbit hole path of who I am today. The past six or 7 years, I've really been doing a lot of trauma-informed work and thinking about how that is it's a thing that happens. And so I think the next slide, love if we could just, So what has been going on this past year? I don't know how many of you have felt like either like in the comments or in your video, how many of you felt like you've been waiting to exhale this past year, like holding on for dear life, trying to figure out like, when is this going to be over? I certainly felt like that. We have, just trying to get to May. Exactly. It means high anxiety at times, yes. Thank you for sharing. So we have, we've been going through a pandemic. And I remember distinctly, I got a message on my phone from, I don't remember, some news station. And it was like, CDC has declared world pandemic. And that was the moment that I was like, holy cow, this is a big deal. And I didn't, I thought it was going to be just a couple months. And now we're dealing with a whole year. So we're dealing with a health pandemic in this past year, but we've also dealt with visibly seeing people murdered and violence. So from George Floyd to hearing about Breonna Taylor to the others who we don't know their names. Communities of color have been continuously experiencing violence, and we have seen it visualized this past year in a way that I don't feel we quite have. And so and we've also been asked to reconfigure our work, reconfigure our lives, reconfigure everything. So it's really has been a flipping upside down, if you will. And so what I invite you all to do is take a big breath in and exhale everything out from that waiting to exhale. Because it's been a lot. It's been a lot. And if you could go to the next slide, Abby. So let's talk about this big T word, trauma. I find that there's a lot of words on the screen before we get distracted with that. I feel like trauma is that word that we don't like to use. It's a scary word. It feels scary. I know when I first was introduced to it, it just felt like this thing was so foreign to me, especially working in higher education. It was in student affairs. Our counseling center, we had a relationship with them, working in student activities and student affairs. Sometimes it was in our student affairs, sometimes it was in other areas. And so it felt like so foreign to me and something I couldn't really touch coming from that education background. And but what I found in my own learning and education around trauma is that we've all experienced trauma. And so trauma has traditionally been classified and defined as anybody who's experienced a major disaster, accident, or something like rape or violence. And it can feel so disconnected. That definition can feel so disconnected from other things that we experience. And what I have this definition here. So trauma can be defined as any unresolved autonomic nervous system response. It's about the nervous system's response to an event, not necessarily the event itself. Events can affect each of us very differently. And this is by Jennifer Molson. She wrote an article about a way to heal trauma. And what I really love about this definition or this reference to trauma is that, similar to oppression, we can get into like oppression Olympics, like, oh, what I experienced was worse than you. And trauma is really our nervous system's response and how we respond to experiences or events. And all of us can, there are many of us that can respond differently. So it's helping to normalize trauma. And I'm on a mission to normalize trauma and recognize that we've all experienced trauma at some point in our life. And that gets, Abby, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Keegan, I really appreciate this definition that it's more about how our nervous system responded to the event and not the event itself. Because I think sometimes we think that we don't deserve the response that we have because we weren't in a car accident or we didn't witness violence or right. But there are still things that can feel traumatic and how we respond to them. And that norming is just as important.
Yes, exactly. And I think that, that goes to this idea of the forms of trauma.
Mhm.
There's different forms of trauma. We just, like we think, oh, okay, yeah, I didn't have this major life event. I didn't go to war. And we've witnessed those things in our life.
Mhm.
And that is one form of trauma, vicarious trauma.
Yeah.
We have actually, we are vicariously living through trauma more and more because of the way media has portrayed events in our world.
Yeah.
So with the invention of smartphones, and that brings to what I feel that almost all of us who are paying attention have experienced vicarious trauma
Mhm.
because of George Floyd, because of the murder of George Floyd,
Right.
and then now with his trial going on.
Right.
And so that's just, when we think about that, that's just one.
Mhm.
And so the other, there's direct trauma, there's other forms of trauma, but I really wanted to speak to this. So thank you, Abby, for sharing that, because
Yeah.
we can feel like we're not deserving of
Mhm.
paying attention, or even labeling that for ourselves.
Right.
And I know that was personally for me. I often felt like I kind of dismissed my childhood experiences because I got out of them, because I became college educated, because
Mhm.
I went and got a master's degree, because I had a career.
Right.
And there were people who were like me, who I knew of, that didn't.
Mhm.
I thought, well, I can't really, I don't want to play victim to that.
Right.
Well, I was almost dismissing that, and it came up in my health a lot of times, and I didn't realize it.
Mhm.
So how does trauma show up in our body? And so going back to that, oh, if you could go
Right.
back just for a second, sorry. Oh, there we were. One more.
This one? Oh,
Where
yes.
we
How
were.
trauma shows
Yes.
up.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Sorry.
Thank you. I was like, where did we go now? Um, So how trauma shows up in the body. So going back to the response. So I get really nerdy here. My background is in science. I actually, before I was in college, I did like pre-med science, technology, magnet schooling. And so I was like really nerdy. I've always been. This also probably goes back to my input. But there's three responses: fight. People know fight and flight, right? And there's also freeze. And so there's a researcher who's done a lot of work. His name's Peter Levine. I have this resource in the slide, so don't, yes, you can write it down, but I have some resources to share with you. So what he speaks about is like there's fight, flight, or freeze. And we forget that there's a freeze. And oftentimes freeze is like our shutdown mode. And so how it shows up is that we just want to pull ourselves under the cover and be like, it's too much. I can't do it. I need to stop. And that's how it shows up. It shows up from extreme fatigue. So for some of you, there we go. I think I'm back. For some of you, you talked about like, yes, I feel tired, or sometimes I'm feeling tired all the time. Extreme fatigue is a response to trauma. Um, feeling like brain fog, feeling like you're confused, or your memory is affected. Now, some of us might be a little older, and we may point the finger to, oh yeah, well, it's just getting old. And also, like, how can we look back and be like, oh, but actually, this is a response to what's happening right now. It's normalizing, like, okay, I'm all right, I'm safe. Because what the body wants to do is to feel safe. And when it
Right.
doesn't feel safe, it gets locked into that like cycle of staying in consistent fight, flight, or freeze.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to share a few of these because I think it's really helpful when we think about, where am I at? Where are my students at? Where are my staff at? Where are the people that I work with? Where is my community at? It's helpful to be like, okay, let me take a little like scan of that.
Mhm.
Um, and if you could go to the next slide. Oh, yes. So talking about how it shows up in our body and going back to the response, oftentimes um, we may not recognize that there's a history that moves beyond it. And so this James Baldwin is speaking to ancestral trauma. So before we've been born, like, and this has been studied in, this is recently coming, I feel like coming more and more out into public about the ancestral trauma that Black, Brown, Indigenous peoples have experienced. So what I love about the land acknowledgement is acknowledging the history that has happened in colonization of the United States, and that there's a history there, and that our history is very much in our present self. So yes, it's a past, but we also really got to look at it. It's present here, and it does live in our body. And if you could go to the next slide. Yes. So speaking about community. So when we're, we know that we're experiencing this individually. What does it look like as a community? And so I really like to focus on community well-being. I love this quote. It's about our social, economic, environmental, cultural, and political conditions identified by individuals and their communities as essential for them to flourish and fulfill their potential. Whew, that's a mouthful. That's a mouthful. What I love about LeaderShape and leadership education, my theory of choice was the socially responsible leadership. So really looking at how we can look at both individual, how we relate to each other, and then community leadership. And leadership, our community is so integral. Yet sometimes it can be taken out of the picture or not thought of right away, especially in decision making. And so I think a lot of times in trauma, we because it hasn't been normalized, we just think, oh, it's just been it's been a long year. Like, I can't wait till May, or like when finals are done. And then we just move on to the next thing. And we forget to think about like, okay, what did that reflection piece to me is so important of what have we experienced collectively? Not just in my, hub of my workspace or my own like small place that I'm connected to, but thinking about what have been like external things that have happened that have impacted us, and how has that shown up in our bodies, who we are, the way we've interacted, the way we communicate with each other. And so some things that I find really helpful is knowing when to press pause. I think some of you responded and said that you sometimes have been asked to just push forward. And I think part of that is that, we just, there's a bottom line, and we need to keep moving ahead. And so being able to take a step back, that's part of leadership, I think, is taking a step back to be like, okay, let's think about how we're like, let's pause here, instead of jumping to the next thing. Setting boundaries. I think setting boundaries is not something we're always taught. It's something that we learn. I see some head shaking. Yeah, like it's usually when we know like, oh wait, we've kind of like gone too far. And so learning to say no, like that's part of community well-being, is to say no, this isn't going to be supportive. No, this isn't within our vision, or this isn't within our, like where we're at right now. I find that incorporating mindfulness in our work and everyday life, that's part of the setting boundaries. Like the reflection is such a piece. And resilience actually comes in, it's actually occurs in community. So people think that resilience is individual, and it is. It's something inherent within us. We're really super resilient as human beings and as communities. However, there's a community piece to it. So take a moment to just think about, something that you've gone through, maybe a challenge or an obstacle in your life. And so for those of you that are alive, just take a moment to think about, like, what's one difficult challenge I've had in my life, and think about how you got through it. Who was around you? Were there others that were encouraging you or inspiring you? Were there others checking in with you? And so I'd love to hear, you can just pop in the chat, like, from that mini little reflection, were there other people supporting you? I know for me, when I think about the challenging moments in my life, there was usually at least one person, or there were communities that I could plug into to say, hey, I got you. Or reminding me of my brilliance, reminding me of, you're going through a difficult time, it's okay, and I'm here to support you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question too. I know as people are responding, perhaps in the chat too, I see Charles's response there. Just in thinking about, it can be really hard to reflect, to go back to that place, and to be keeping in mind that as we talk about trauma and Keegan's, the ways in which you've built up how we're thinking about it right now, and that community that was with us, right? I think sometimes it's easy to feel that we were alone. And Charles is right, I think, in the comment here about that you were the only one that could understand what you were going through. But hopefully there's, in that reflection and thinking about, like you said, Keegan, in your example too, who was there with you, and who did you know you could trust or rely on, and thinking about that too. I really appreciate this reflection and thinking about maybe the ways in which we can remind ourselves how we are resilient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you shared something. I just had a thought and then it went away. I'll come back again. That's what it was, around Brene Brown. So Brene Brown says that we are wired for connection.
Mm-hmm.
We are so wired for connection. And in that connection is vulnerability. Like the pathway to connection is vulnerability.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most challenging things is that we have a society that we see people that have it all put together. And social media is like such a nice little organizer of that. For lack of a producer. Social media is a producer of, we have our stuff together.
Mm-hmm.
In all reality, it's not the case. And it really takes a moment to, have that self-awareness, or to say, like, hey, I'm not doing well, and to have your people to say that with, who can be like, oh, okay, I see you. And I think back, the person for me in my life has been my aunt, and she stopped for a moment when I was a teenager. And she said, hey, like, what's happening right now, what you're doing right now is not going to get you. And it was like, she was like, look, I know I know you're going through a hard time. And her being vulnerable with me to say, look, I don't know what you're going through.
Mhm.
And I've also experienced some difficult things growing up. So you can talk to me. And then just that like little window of vulnerability gave it an opportunity for me to be like, oof, okay, like let me just put down the armor. That's what
Mhm.
I love Brene Brown's work around vulnerability and connection. And it's so integral to resilience for
Yeah.
us to like move forward together.
She's taught us so much.
Mhm, mhm.
I appreciate Steven's comment here in the chat too, just in thinking about how these times of COVID has made that relational healing really challenging because we can't. I'm kind of extrapolating, I think, Stephen, but just thinking about how we can't be in physical contact with people, or that it might seem harder to reach out to those networks and those communities where normally you would run into them at the hallway at work, or you would see them so regularly and organically that it's been harder to do that for sure. Yeah. Thank
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Stephen, for that. Yes, exactly. And let alone that, I mean, we've been forced to cover our faces,
Mhm.
to put masks on, obviously for like public health. And I'm not saying, that we should disregard that, but that there's been so many barriers
Mhm.
that we've been faced to it's almost like we've been forced to disconnect,
Mhm.
and it's really challenged our humanity. It's challenged who we are at our core, which our core is community and connection. And so with that, we've been forced to like find a new way and to hold on for dear life to get through it in some way.
It has felt like that sometimes.
Mhm, mhm.
Mhm.
Um, if we could go on to the next slide here. So what do we do? So we've been forced to kind of disconnect, to be isolated in some ways. And so how do we move from the self-care to community care? Um, Self-care has been, I feel like I've been an advocate for self-care for such a long time, especially I feel that people who are in the helping profession, in higher education. And then I also think that even if you're not in higher education, you are in some sort of helping profession. You're helping to create something, um, and you're of service to someone or something. And part of that is that we often forget to take care of ourselves, and that in getting to community wellness, part of that is like starting with ourself, that self-care, and then also moving to the community care. So what are some things that we can do to move forward? Settling our own nervous system before we engage with others. Like breathing is, I have a breathing practice and a meditation practice. Sometimes it's not for everybody, but when I am going out into my life, when I'm meeting with other people or I'm getting ready to jump into a Zoom, I take a few deep breaths and I ground myself. And that has been so important for my own like being present, so that I can presently go into the space of, okay, a healthy thriving community, and not feeling like I'm so wrapped up in my own um, nervous system firing off from whatever is happening. um, and one of the things that has been really, I think, has really hit into community wellness is the collective healing process and being able to harmonize. So this comes out of my grandmother's hands. It's a book around racialized trauma and healing from that. It's incredible. Um, and there's a lot of practices that I think can be so supportive when we're working with staff or students. So even though like trauma is this thing that's been connected in the mental health world, it is something that I think as leadership educators, we can adopt and not be the experts, but be informed. And so what I'd love to do actually, if you can, is go on camera. And if you're not able to be in a place, like if you're driving or, you're not able to be focused, that's totally fine. But if you are able to be on camera, it would be great if you can be on camera. And just take a moment so this harmonizing is being able to connect. So getting back to that connection. If you can, on the screen here, just take a moment to like find somebody and make eye contact with them. And just being able to look at somebody's eyes for a moment. In our little boxes. Yes, stuffing your face. That's okay, Ginger. Totally fine. Yes, where if you can. And making eye contact with somebody for just a moment. And as you make eye contact, start to take a deep breath in. And then deep breath out. And do a few like that, breathing in and breathing out. And that audible exhale, breathing in and breathing out. This is called harmonizing, breathing in and breathing out. Breathing in and breathing out. You can let go of that. What was that like for you all? Anybody can shout out in the chat.
Keegan, I was thinking, as others are perhaps responding in the chat, I was thinking like, what a simple reminder that we are all doing something. Like we're all doing this one thing right now. And that, I think that is such a simple connection to community, and perhaps those times where we feel like we feel alone, or we feel that no one is around us, that sometimes just that simple reminder that, oh, I am in a space, even if it is this virtual space, of doing the same thing that other people in this virtual space are doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And even the breathing. So the breathing is really, it's connecting to our nervous system. So it's kind of tapping into a channel that is subconscious, but we can all be connected to, and that we can be connected to together. So I love that you shared that in terms of like the feeling of, okay, we're all doing this, we're all together, we're not alone. And that's part of it. Yes, melting the tension. That is an activity actually that comes out of the book, My Grandmother's Hands. And a lot of this is actually comes from Indigenous communities. So I think about this like going to gospel church and people singing together, like what that does for my well-being. For me, there was a church, I used to live in San Francisco, so there was a church, Glide Church, and I absolutely loved it. You got up and sang. It was very connected to Southern roots of church, of singing, and how singing in many Indigenous communities is a way of harmonizing the trauma that they've experienced. So harmonizing that to be able to settle the nervous system so that we can all come back down to ground to actually connect with each other. When our nervous systems are off, so when we've experienced trauma, and especially this year, we've all experienced trauma. If we haven't paid attention and settled that nervous system, we're going to keep firing off in that like fight, flight, or freeze mode and never get to homeostasis, never get to like, okay, I'm at peace. And when I'm at peace, I can start to think more clearly. I can start to respond. I can start to feel like an openness rather than a closeness. And so a few ways that I've done that is just that simple activity. Like, all right, everybody, let's just take a deep breath together and then exhale out. It's like the simplest thing, yet it's, wow, how do we not think of that, of having that on our agenda for a staff meeting or a community meeting? Like, what? Oh my goodness, breathing, that's something that we all do together. The other piece is grieving. So again, going to Native Indigenous ancestral spaces, grieving is a normal process, and there's so many rituals around grieving. And I don't feel like we have in the United States, in our white-centric communities, there isn't a normal, like there isn't a process of grieving. It's been, pushed aside. It hasn't been allowed. Some of our workplaces only give us 3 days, where there's some communities that grieve for a whole year. That doesn't mean that we close up our doors and not talk to anybody, but there's a process to that. So there are ways to give space for grieving and honoring, like, I think about our students that are in traditional colleges and like grieving that they didn't get the chance, and that's okay. Like being able to just acknowledge that allows the space to release that trauma, to release that holding on, that gripping, which is the part of the fight, flight, or freeze, our nervous system's in the stuck mode. And cultivating communities of resilience. So I spoke to that a little bit. Audre Lorde is one of my favorite, well, I have a lot of favorite people, but I love this, that caring for myself is not self-indulgent. It's okay to care for ourselves. It's an act of political warfare, political resistance. It's an act of saying, our hierarchy, we've been put in we have a system that has been placed. It's white supremacy system. It's patriarchal. It's like everything's organized, and it doesn't give us the space to say, all right, let's take care of ourselves. Let's take care of each other first. And so we're fighting that. We're trying to unlearn some of these systems and start to get back to a different place, to a place of where we have been before. But because of colonization, we have systems right now that don't allow for that to happen. Oh, that was a lot. Okay, that was a lot. We went down another road, but it's all related. It's all related. So I do have some guiding questions, which I think would be really great, for you to either reflect on now, but where do you see yourself? So this is for folks who are either here live or watching the recording. Where do you see yourself in creating opportunities for these conversations, community well-being? And where do you see the gap in focusing on your own wellness, the wellness of your staff or students as you look ahead this coming year? Do you see any opportunities to collaborate or other groups to bring awareness? I love this question. What does a thriving community of wellness look, feel, and sound like to you? I almost feel like this is the question that we could all spend a lot of time reflecting on and thinking about. So for those of you who are here live, what does a thriving community of wellness look, feel, and sound like to you? Whether you've experienced it or whether you have imagined it.
That is such a big and kind question, I think, Keegan, as people are considering answers to that, just in the ways in which you've invited us to dream about a welcomed community that can think about their own, how they're thriving or how maybe they're not in this time, right? How we can be supportive of each other. Stephen, I agree with your comment here about we need maybe 2 days to just think about just that question, right? And imagine what that community could look like. I really appreciate that too. I see Charles's comment here too, Keegan. A role that you can play individually, but maybe not a role for your own community. I do not see a role for my own community, would not support or even appreciate this issue. Yeah, that's a hard place to start from. I think if that community that you're already a part of isn't appreciative of or knowledgeable about, I think that that is a hard and discouraging place to start from for sure. And I know that in our, I don't mean to give anything away, but I know our next slide has some resources too. And so Charles, I hope those resources that Keegan has put together will be helpful as well. Any
Yeah,
other?
I
Yeah.
think it can be. I love that you commented on that, Abby, and thank you, Charles, for your um, candor and honesty about where you're at and what you're facing. It's such a tension to come to be like, okay, I can do that for myself, but I don't see it supported. And it can be such a tricky place to be in. And I think even being able for you to acknowledge that, and we can get into such a place of fixing and doing and doing and doing. And part of resilience is actually being.
Mhm.
And that is like, what does that mean? What does it mean to be? What do you mean just be?
Yeah.
And living in that question, like, I don't know if this is supported here.
Mhm.
What would it look like to be supported? Even being able to be in that question allows you to give the space, the tension to release within yourself.
Mhm.
And then getting to the place of like the resources, like finding out, are there other communities, like other folks outside of my own direct space that I can
Right.
connect with, or being a part of these conversations. I know when I've had those challenges where I felt like, well, this wasn't supported, I reached out, I picked up the phone and would call somebody who I knew could support me and like, hey, could you talk to me about that? So that's something that is supportive for me, but it
Yeah.
is a difficult place to be in. And to even name that is so important. So thank you, Charles, for bringing that up. Because I
Yeah.
don't think you're alone.
Yeah. I agree. I like Kai, I hope I'm saying your name right. I like Kai's comment here about it, just that reads like a vision statement for a thriving community of wellness, I think. And I really appreciate that and what that looks like. It feels really supportive and encouraging. And I like that the identity is based in nature too. I think we have so many healing properties in nature if only we will allow ourselves to spend more time in it. Um,
Mhm.
Colby, I like your comment here too, and I'm not surprised knowing you that you've included movement in that thriving community of wellness. I think that perhaps a health or a physical activity element makes a lot of sense here as well.
Mhm. Yeah, movement is so key. And part of that, the trauma informed work is is somatically moving through, so physically moving that trauma, because it does actually get locked in our bodies, and that can show up as like tension, or subconsciously we may not actually feel it. So improv is such a great tool for like moving things through, or even laughter,
Mhm.
like laughing things out. I used to do this activity I learned from one of my students. Actually, I used to work orientation or oversee orientation, and one of my orientation leaders, I think he was in improv, and he did this activity where it was, we counted down and we shook out each limb. And it was such a cool way, like, so going back to that harmonizing, that's one way to harmonize. So we can think of these like simple, like team builders and activities that we've done and not realize like, oh wait, these are actually ways we've harmonized, and ways that we are settling our nervous systems and moving through any individual traumas and collective traumas to get on the same page.
Mhm.
So I love the like movement, because as a yoga teacher, I'm all about that. And also just, I think moving is such a great way to
Yeah.
um, heal and to transform.
Mhm.
I love that.
Yeah.
I'm just reading throughout. Thank you all so much for the comments. Yeah, I think I love Brandon, being there for students. Empathy is such a critical piece.
Mhm.
And going back to like that vulnerability conversation, I think sometimes as professionals, we can feel afraid to share our own personal experience, or not share too much. But even just like I shared, I've had so many experiences where I share just one small sliver of my own life, or hey, I'm just not feeling 100% today.
Mhm.
It creates like that doorway. It's like such a small window to open up for that deep connection.
Yeah. I want to make sure that we can share these resources that you've put together as well. Keegan, do you mind if I share that slide?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm catching up on these comments. And I love that we really got to think about what a thriving community could look,
Mhm.
feel, and sound like. It really gets to the senses.
Yeah.
Um, so some of the resources that I have here, I spoke to some of them. My Grandmother's Hand, so that's by Resma McKekem, and I am totally butchering his name. Um, Maybe not, but I feel like I'm butchering it. Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies.
Mhm.
And this has been a profound book. I think it's so important because we all either we are someone of color or of indigenous community, or we've oppressed. So we are in a world where this is happening.
Mhm.
Racialized trauma exists, and so how can we um, connect to that and think about how we can show up in a more informed place.
Mhm.
Waking the tiger is this what I spoke to. So that speaks a lot to like how the fight, flight, or freeze. It's also that's been an incredible book. The Body Keeps a Score. It talks about how trauma actually shows up on our bodies. It's a
Mhm.
researcher who he started actually with vets from the Vietnam War, and that's how he started looking at trauma. So shifting from that clinical uh, definition of trauma to something more community based.
Keegan, I read that book last summer and have
Oh,
thought of it
awesome!
every day since. It
Yeah,
just kind of blew my mind.
yeah.
Mm.
It blew my mind too. There were some things I was like, oh wow, that's something
Yeah.
I didn't think about
Yeah.
before. Something I didn't think about before. The 6 dimensions of wellness model, a lot of folks use this in the wellness industry and on your campuses if you work at a campus. But I think this is just a great point of reference. I was introduced to it through Holsty, Holsty I was introduced to through LeaderShape. And Holsty has used this in each month they have a theme, and
Mhm.
one of them was around wellness. And so how can we like incorporate this into our work every day? And I shared the TED Talk as well. So these are just a few resources. There's so many more out there. And if anybody has any resources, you can definitely drop those in the chat as well. I always love learning about other resources that are available. And I know LeaderShape has resources too.
That's right. That's right. You brought up so much about resilience, and I'm thinking about our own resilience program too that we offer. But Keegan, before I share about that, I just want to thank you for this beautiful space that you've created to talk about this topic that it can be really hard to talk about, and it can be really uncomfortable and difficult to get to that place and talking about it. And thank you for being so gracious and kind with us and sharing about your own experiences and your knowledge in a way that I think just from reading the chat and hearing about how people are responding has been really helpful for people too. So thank you so much for that. I appreciate that. I've shared Keegan's website here, keegancmills.com, if folks would like to reach out to Keegan, perhaps have more resources and to learn more about Keegan's work and to reach out to Keegan about that as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
A brief commercial here. Thank you all for joining us to talk about LeaderShape. As well as I just mentioned, we do have a resilience program. We have an open enrollment session of that coming up next week, actually. if folks are willing to kind of expand on this learning a little bit more and learn some more with us, we also have our Courageous Dialogue, Catalyst, and Institute programs here. So if you want to reach out to us and learn more about those programs, if you're new to learning about LeaderShape, there's our website if you want to learn more about us as well. And just as a reminder, LeaderShape is a not-for-profit, and our mission is to help a cause that's larger than our own. And so we've got a link to our donation page if you're interested in contributing. These sessions are free to attend. We've been, as I said at the beginning, we've been hosting these. This is our 6th week. We have more sessions going on the rest of this week as well on other topics that you might be interested in. So check back on social media to learn more about that. But Keegan, thank you so much. I really appreciated this hour with you and talking about this topic that is hard to talk about, and you've provided it in such a way that is helpful for people to learn more and to want to learn more and to do better and how we process our own trauma and see how it's affecting us too. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, Abby. Thank you. I so appreciate the time, and for those of you who showed up and those of you who couldn't make it or are watching the recording, it's even acknowledging you to show up in this space. It really supports us all in moving forward.
Yeah, for sure. I think I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but we are recording this. We will share links to the recording at the early next week. We will share links to the recording with everyone who has registered for the sessions this week. So you will find those recordings if you wanted to watch it again or share it with someone that you think might benefit from this. But thank you all for joining us today.